I wanted to tell you guys about my mentally unstable neighbor who I will be calling Kay to respect her privacy. I don't want to call her crazy or anything else that contributes to the stigmatization of severe mental illness. This story isn't going to be exaggerated to be more creepy or anything like that. It's just what happened. We had just moved into our new home, which we had recently built in a town in Texas. It all started when my parents began finding small pills scattered around our backyard near the fences. Just a few here and there. We ended up Googling the numbers on the pills to find out that most of them were antidepressants, but I cannot remember the exact names, as this was about a year or so ago, but I think there was at least one pill that Google said was an antipsychotic medication. We were pretty confused, but mostly worried about our dog eating them before we could find them. This kept happening over the next few weeks, and then we found unopened water and Gatorade bottles thrown over our fence. The side of the house this was coming from had a somewhat empty lot next door. We had soon-to-be neighbors building their new house there, but it wasn't like the construction workers were throwing their trash over our fence. These bottles were unopened and full. For reference, Kay lives a few houses down from mine on the corner. Between our house and hers are 2 empty lots. The lot closest to us had a new house being built there, and after another week or so of this came the fights, or maybe incidents, I should say. Kay would routinely storm out of her house and go yell at the construction workers. I don't know why exactly, but apparently about nonsense things. Sometimes she would yell from her yard, and sometimes she would walk into the lot to yell. There have been several occasions where she was seen yelling at no one, just standing in the lot or walking around the construction supplies and arguing with herself. By now, most of the people on our street knew of her and were afraid of her. Up until this point, I had never seen Kay. I attended university an hour away and was only home on the weekends. One weekend, my parents left me home alone in the middle of the day. I think they were at the gym or the grocery store. I'm the only child, too. I had just gotten out of the shower and walked downstairs to hear yelling. I peek outside the windows to see a middle-aged blonde lady arguing. I couldn't see who she was talking to, but I could hear another male voice. Now, I had not met Kay yet, but I also hadn't met my new neighbors. But my parents had, so my first thought was that this was the new couple building next door. My new neighbors. It seemed like they were arguing about the house. After a few minutes, the blonde lady walks away, and then a couple came out of the unfinished house and got into their car, parked on the street. I'm really confused at this point, especially when the man walks over to my door and rings the doorbell. I'm very introverted, so I opted to not answer the door. Kind of stupid, I know. My parents weren't home anyway, so it wouldn't have made a difference, I thought. After a minute, he walks back to his car, and from the window I can see he is sitting there on the driver's side doing something. He comes back with a note that he leaves on my door, and then he and his wife drive away. After I'm sure they're gone, I get the note and read it. Apparently, my neighbors were checking out the house when they saw Kay, the blonde lady attempting to get into my backyard. They confronted her, and that's what the yelling was. In a rush, I sent a pic of the note to my mom, called my mom, etc. She didn't seem that worried about it, but I knew that we always left the back door unlocked during the day. If she had gotten through our fence gates, she could have easily walked inside the house while I was home alone. After that, my stepdad got some new locks for the little gate doors at the front of our house. Things continued like this for a while, with Kay trying to get into our backyard, throwing pills and water bottles over our fence. A couple times she was rummaging around our front flower beds too. There was one instance which really unnerved my parents. We have a small alleyway that runs behind our house, connecting everyone's driveways. Another neighbor, who lives across the alleyway from us, contacted my parents to let them know they had seen Kay looming around our back fence gate at around 3 a.m. that night. Not sure why those neighbors were awake at that time, but they said Kay was just standing there in the middle of the alleyway staring at our back fence. Knowing we had someone essentially casing our house in the middle of the night was really starting to freak us out. The guy who built our house, who I'm naming Jay, somehow got into contact with someone who knew Kay's family pretty well. Everyone wanted answers to why Kay was acting like this, and since Jay had built most of the houses in the area and was well connected, people were asking him. I think he was friends with the realtor who sold the house to Kay, but I'm not sure. Anyway, Jay was able to give us a lot of information about Kay. Apparently her family was rich and owned a very big corporation, like one of the biggest in the US. Now I won't say any name. Again, for her privacy, and her family had essentially placed her in this house away from the rest of them. They did not want to deal with her mental illness, but more importantly, 2 years ago, her only son died of a drug overdose, and she's been unstable ever since. The reason why she wants to get into our backyard and keeps throwing stuff over the fence is because she believes her son is there. I'm not sure if she thinks we're holding him hostage, or his ghost is here or what, but that's why. She's been to several psychiatric hospitals throughout her life, and now she's stopped taking her medication because she's throwing it over our fence. Things finally came to a head in January of 2020, when, during one of her usual arguments with the construction workers, she pulled out a BB gun. She was already very aggressive, so the BB gun just made things 100 times worse. I don't know if she just threatened to shoot them or actually did, but the cops were called regardless. It took them a while to talk her down, with several police officers swarming the street with big guns. I'm just thankful that my parents have been filling out police reports, so when they came, they knew about Kay's history of mental illness. I'm both grateful and a little surprised that they handled the situation so well, because not a lot of police departments probably train their officers to deal with mentally ill patients, especially those experiencing psychosis. I still have ring camera videos of the police officers with big rifles loitering around our front lawn while assessing the situation. I might post that for proof, but I'm not sure it's necessary. Anyway, after that incident, Kay was not seen for a long time. We hear she was in a psychiatric hospital for many months, after which she returned to our neighborhood. She's doing much better now. She no longer does any of the strange behavior she used to. Almost every day, me and my parents see her walk her dog past our house. She's clearly sticking to her routine, and I am happy for her. This just happened, and I'm sorry it turned out to be a long story. I got off work and went to my mom's to help her and my dad set up a new Alexa TV they just got. It ended up taking a while because we had to run to the store to grab an adapter, so I didn't leave their house until about 8 p.m., and by the time I got home, I recently moved a few weeks ago and lived alone. It was close to 9 p.m. and pitch black. I have my hands full of a few things I forgot at my parents' house since I stayed with them for a month before I found my place. Anyway, I was walking up the sidewalk to my apartment when I heard him calling out to me.
Hey, excuse me. Hello, hey.
He was politely persistent. I had one headphone in, listening to YouTube stories, and I was trying to pretend like I didn't hear him. I wasn't trying to be rude, but because it's pitch black outside. I've been up since 6 a.m. and I'm dead tired. I don't like small talk and I'm bad at it, but eventually, I turn around and we introduce ourselves. Immediately, the hairs on my arms prickle, and I get this feeling in my gut. This guy is sizing me up. He wants to know where I live to see if he can break into my place, rob me, etc. It's just something I know. It's not even a feeling, but a fact. The entire time while we were talking, maybe for about 10 minutes, he had his hands in his pockets, his hood up, and kept looking around like he was expecting to see someone. Granted, it's cold, but we live in Arizona, so it's not that cold, but this strange behavior that he displayed was putting me on edge. Then, he begins asking about me, how long ago I moved in, which unit I'm in, etc. He's obviously going to see which unit I'm in when I walk into it, so I just told him. He made small talk for a few minutes and then asked if it's just me. I explain, oh no, I've got my 2 dogs with me. I go on to also say how big they are, how protective they are, and how they are roaming freely in my apartment while I'm at work, which is all true. He then asked if I take them on walks and how often. Then he asked, how often do you leave your apartment empty? I explained that I have to be careful because, while my dogs love me and act like big babies with me, they're very protective. So going out is a challenge because I have to be careful of people coming up to us and how my dogs react to them. I turned the conversation around and asked which unit he was in, how long he'd been here, who he lived with, etc. He seemed uncomfortable and gave me vague answers, waving his hand behind him and saying,
"Oh, you know. Well, you know."
He seems uncomfortable about me trying to clarify which apartment he's in, so he tapers off the conversation and we say our goodbyes. I unlocked my door and gave my dogs a command to bark, which they did, and it was very loud and vicious sounding. I immediately had them in my arms, gave them food, and called my mom. I told my mom about this guy. I gave her his name, told her what he looks like, his vague portrayal of what apartment he's in, and reminded her of our panic phrase. So if I ever say it, she knows to calmly end the call and send the police. Now I'm just sitting in my apartment, freaking out at every little sound, with my dogs piled on top of me, typing this out. I'm going to call the non-emergency police and ask them to do a drive-by to make me feel safer. Later on, I was sitting on my couch, replying to comments on Facebook. It was 9:30 p.m. on a Friday night when I began to hear the softest knocking on my door. If I weren't 3 feet from the front door, I wouldn't have heard it. Both my dogs were out, and my blue nose pit began barking. Everything was all locked up tight. Obviously, I didn't answer, but I don't have a peephole, so I had no idea who it was. Was I just overreacting? The following day, I just got home and noticed a light on in my car. The windows are up, the passenger side is locked, and you can only open the driver's door a certain way. So I don't see anyone opening it, and his number is in my window on the outside with a message saying, "Text me." On the back of the paper is information about a court date and such. I'm going to call the non-emergency police and add it to my report. Oh, and I've also updated everyone keeping an eye on me. So yeah, I'm still freaked out. During my senior year of college, I lived next door to a really weird dude. We lived in a house with a few rooms on each floor, and on my floor, it was just me and him. Some of it was pretty run-of-the-mill, gross college boy stuff. His room reeked of dirty laundry from all the way down the hall, and when he would leave his door open, I could see that he had no sheets or blankets on his bed, just a bare mattress, and most of his stuff was just lying on the floor or in boxes. This was months after we moved in, by the way. Then there was slightly weirder stuff, like how he watched the Military History Channel at 4 a.m. at close to maximum volume on his TV. And the weird electrical zapping noises I'd occasionally hear coming from his room also always late at night. But the creepiest incident by far was when we had a house party. It was late in the night, and everyone was really drunk. I had retired to my room to hang out with my boyfriend. Then, all of a sudden, I hear weird noises coming from my neighbor's room, stumbling around, slapping and struggling. I noticed it, but honestly didn't think too much of it because he was always up to weird shit, and I was drunk and exhausted. A few minutes later, he knocks on my door. He was trying to get me to help him or something and keeps saying,
"I don't know what to do."
She's passed out on my bed. I look in his room, and sure enough, there's a girl lying on his still bare mattress. Suddenly, those noises I just heard seemed a lot more concerning. I didn't know the girl and wasn't sure what to do, but thankfully a few of her friends showed up just then, took her out of his room, and helped her find a safe place to rest. I'm still not sure what happened that night. I don't think anything too terrible happened to the girl, but it definitely could have if her friends hadn't taken her away. So normally, at night, I put a big box fan in my window. It's loud and keeps my room cool. I've always been uncomfortable about my neighbors being able to see me through my window, but I never really thought they would do anything more than an accidental glance while I was sleeping. Well, last night I got into a little scare when I saw my neighbor in his house with his light on, staring into my room. I just brushed it off and thought maybe I was just seeing something somehow. I checked again, and I definitely did not just see something. He was still there and didn't even turn back. He was just staring into my soul while smiling at me. Our neighbors have always been a little weird, always doing little things like watering the grass while it's raining, and they smoke and drink a lot as well. This was a very unsettling experience, and I'm only 14. What could or should I do to stop my neighbors? They've always been kind of weird and creepy, but not to this extent. I might just be overthinking this situation, but it creeped me out so much. As much as I want help for this, it's also kind of a creepy story, but not horrible. I've been in scarier situations. I grew up in Arizona, in a relatively safe city. Before myself or any of my friends had a driver's license, we would walk everywhere just to get out of the house and do something, typically going to Circle K for soda and snacks, or Walmart or Target just to browse around. One time, when my 2 friends and I were 15, we were walking back to her house through her neighborhood around sunset. At that time, everyone in Arizona was fairly friendly, so whenever you would pass by another person or group, you would exchange a hello or a wave. This time in particular, we were walking past a house on a corner that had a kitchen light on, where a middle-aged man was washing his dishes. When he made eye contact with us, my natural instinct was to smile, and my friend's was to wave. What a bad idea. The man immediately dropped his dishes in the sink, and what felt like a second later was outside on the corner, staring at us in an aggressive stance with both hands balled into fists. All of our flight or fight responses were completely different. One friend immediately took off, running in the other direction. My other friend peed her pants, and I was frozen in complete fear. He started charging toward us in full force, and I am so grateful that my friend grabbed my arm and we all started running as fast as we could. I was so scared. I was last in place. The man was well built, appeared to be in great shape, and had no trouble catching up to us. As I'm running, I can hear his footsteps very close behind me. He reached his hand out and tried to grab hold of my hair, but the adrenaline finally kicked in, and I was able to speed off beyond his grip. After a while of running, we realized we were no longer being chased. We hid in safety and called my friend's mom to pick us up and told her what happened. We gave her the location of the house, and we all vowed to never go near that house again. The next morning we woke up, and her mom explained that she checked the address of the house and that whoever was living there was a registered sex offender. I'm not sure if it was explicitly because of this incident, but my friend moved houses shortly after this. Our moms all collectively agreed that we were not allowed to walk alone around anyone's neighborhood, and that if we wanted to go out, a parent should be close by. I completely forgot about this until I was recently talking to my friend, and she brought this night up. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if this man had gotten a better grip on my hair, but I'm thankful to say we got away unharmed. At 27 today, I carry a pocket knife and pepper spray with me at all times. When I was probably 13 or 14 years old, one of my best friends lived about a mile from my house, so naturally she and I used to walk to meet each other regularly. Once, I went over there late. I can't remember exactly why, but our other friend who also lived nearby had walked to meet us as well. We probably smoked a little and had a drink because at that age it's scandalous, fun, or exciting. So, anyway, I walked back to my house late by myself. It was probably about midnight. A man pulled up in his car next to me and insisted I get in the car so he could take me home after I'd explained what I was doing. Something about his behavior told me he was not trying to be kind. I dismissed him several times while he tailed behind me slowly in his car. Eventually, I did the classic pretend to be on the phone trick, naming my exact location and describing his car while I faked going home by ducking into a nearby house's backyard. Surely enough, he sped off as soon as he heard me giving his car description. I still wonder to this day if I could have been abused and murdered or something. Hopefully it's more innocent than it sounds, but if not, I hope he didn't harm anyone else. I lived in a cul-de-sac when I was about 8. My parents were friends with all the people there except for one family. There were 2 guys and I think their mother. One guy in particular was a Marine and was home for some reason. At the get-togethers we would go to at our neighbors' houses, They would always talk about the Marine guy being weird and how they got a bad vibe off him. I didn't really listen to them because when I was a kid, I always had this thing where I thought everyone was nice and a good person, and I didn't listen to them. I thought they were the people being irrational and not giving him a chance. Well, one day I was in my front driveway playing basketball by myself after school. My brother was in his room, and we were home alone as both of my parents were working and would be home soon. The Marine guy came up on a four-wheeler asking if I wanted to take a ride. I said no because I genuinely didn't want to, but he kept asking me. He was very persistent. After about 5 minutes of please and come on, he left. My parents were shocked when I told them, we just recently saw his mug shot on the news. Turns out he's a child molester. This happened in the late fall when I was in my junior year of high school. I skipped school that day because I told my mom I wasn't feeling well. I most definitely exaggerated when I told her I was sick. I wasn't physically sick, I just really wasn't feeling the best that day in general, and I really wanted to skip school. Fast forward to the middle of the day. Probably around noon, I heard this creepy, high-pitched laughter that sounded like it was coming from outside. At first I just assumed it was our neighbor, but as the laughter continued I couldn't help but feel creeped out. I worked myself up, and I started to get this weird feeling inside, almost like something bad was about to happen. I made my way over to my window and peeked outside through the blinds, and right away I saw an older lady standing right before me, literally within 3 inches away. I basically screamed in fear.
What do you want?
I asked. She had this disturbing, perplexed look on her face and this distinct smile that I will never forget. The only thing separating us was the glass window. I then moved my head away from the window and closed my blinds. This all happened in a matter of 10 seconds or less. I walked out of the room and attempted to gather my thoughts. I called my mom, and she said I better wait on calling the police and to call them if the lady gave me any more problems. I went back to my room and I looked out of the window again, and she was gone. I felt an immense amount of relief after that. I knew I wasn't 100% in the clear, though. I looked through all the windows in the house just to make sure she wasn't on our property anywhere else. And to my luck, thankfully, she didn't appear to be anywhere. The rest of the day went on just fine, and nothing more of the old lady came about. But a few days later on Saturday night, it was around 11 o'clock, I assume, I got startled and jumped out of my seat when I heard someone knocking on my window. Right away, my first thought was that the old lady was back. I yelled out to her and told her to go away. I didn't even look out the window this time. She then started laughing again. I then yelled at her loud enough to wake my parents, apparently, because my dad rushed over to my room and asked me what was going on. By now, the laughing and knocking had completely stopped, and I was too scared to explain. So I just pointed at the window and put my finger up to my lips, implying that we needed to be quiet. My dad confusingly walked over to my window and opened the blinds. He was met with the same woman that I saw a few days earlier. She began screaming at us, and she reached behind herself to grab a knife and started flashing it all around at us. This woman was screaming at the top of her lungs, but we had no idea what the hell she was saying. She then opened the window and tried to climb through the window, but because of her old age, she couldn't get herself up in time before my dad pushed her back and shut and locked the window. He called the police, and surprisingly enough, the old woman was still on our property when they arrived. It's my understanding that she rolled her ankle pretty badly and wasn't able to walk much by herself. I think she just gave up and accepted defeat and thought she was going to be arrested. She told the police that she was going to kill us, and she unraveled her entire plan to the officer in an interrogation at the station. The most disturbing thing to me about this story is that this woman had to have been around 70 years old. Crime doesn't have an age limit, I guess, and neither does the horrible things that human beings can do. It's quite clear that she was clinically insane, and my presumption, without a doubt, was correct, that she was elderly and losing her mind. Apparently, she had been living next door in a house that was foreclosed that we thought was completely unoccupied. We had only been living in our home for 2 months tops when all this happened, and there's no telling how long she had been really living in that house. She told police she was there for a few weeks, but we never got much more information than that. It's disturbing to think how long she had been planning this for and how things could have went a lot differently if it weren't for my dad. I made sure to check that my window was locked now, more than I'd like to admit. I finally bought my first house when I was 28 years old. It was in a rough part of town and considerably not the safest neighborhood to live in. You definitely get what you pay for, and I learned my lesson with that. Within my first month of living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened at all, and I was definitely getting settled in, and I thought that I could get used to it, you know? Like, living there. But all that changed quickly. I met the neighbors, and I would have quick, light-hearted small talk with them here and there, but nothing more. Everyone surprisingly seemed quite normal despite the neighborhood that we were in. Of course, there was just one guy that was an oddball out of the few. He lived a couple of houses down in a pretty small and beat-up-looking house. Even more beat up than the others, including mine. He was probably around 45 years old, I'd say. And he always gave me the heebie-jeebies from the exact second I first laid eyes on him. He was average height, a bit overweight, barely had any hair, and almost always wore the same rather dirty-looking clothes. He tried speaking with me a number of times, even though I wasn't very interested in talking to him. I let him rant to me a handful amount of separate times, and he would chat my ears off about the most random and quite unusual things. There's something very off-putting about him. For example, one time I got home from the grocery store and he was walking on the sidewalk towards his house. He stopped and turned around when I pulled into the driveway, and he began talking to me. He started talking about his dead mother and how he hated her and how she was a horrible woman. He seemed very angry and was almost yelling while he was telling me this. Another time, I was sitting on my porch with one of my buds, and he saw us sitting outside and practically invited himself over. He even cut me off while I was talking, and he began yelping about something that happened to him at work. He was a dishwasher at some restaurant, and he was telling us both about how he hates it there and wants to quit. He then started making racist comments about some of the workers there. It was at this point I didn't care about being nice anymore, and I walked inside and signaled to my friend Brendan to come inside with me. I shut and locked the door behind us, and I peeked out my living room window, and thankfully he was walking away. Brendan and I were so bewildered about what had just happened that we started laughing uncontrollably because it was just so weird. Fast forward to later that night, Brendan had too many drinks, so we thought it would be best for him to crash at my place for the night. I had him sleep on the couch because the guest bedroom didn't have a bed in the room yet. At some point in the night, as I was lying in bed, probably about to drift off to sleep soon, I heard a knock on the front door. I looked through the peephole, and I saw that it was the same creepy guy that never seemed to leave me alone. My instinct was to ignore it, but my buddy Brendan said, "Maybe you should just open it, bro, to see what he wants." I kind of sighed, but the man seemed to be afflicted, so I thought the right thing to do would be to open the door and see what he wanted. What he was asking for completely threw me off guard and, quite honestly, angered me immensely. He asked me for $50. I looked at him like he was crazy, and I told him no. I don't have $50 lying around to just give out like that. He said okay and apologized for asking. I thought that was going to be the end of it, so I attempted to shut the door, but he reached out and managed to put his arm between the door and leaned up against it.
Wait, if you don't have any money, can you at least help me out with something? Like food, it could be anything. Just some sort of snack or something that will get me by for the rest of the night. Please.
I thought about helping him, but I was over this guy's games, and I didn't have much food to offer anyway. With it being 11 o'clock at night, I was already pretty bothered by the whole situation in general. So I looked him dead in the eye and firmly told him no and that he needed to leave. I figured I wasn't obligated to feed this man, nor was I obligated to even speak with him if I didn't want to. I went to shut the door again, and that's when he bursted through and tackled me. Brendan got up immediately and pulled him off of me, and the man ended up running away. He probably realized he was outnumbered and didn't stand a chance in a fight with us. When he left, I saw that he had a gun tucked in his pants on his backside, and I couldn't believe it. Was this man going to try and rob me? Or maybe kill me? At this point, something told me that he was wanted by the police because I told the neighbor about what happened a few days later, and she was shocked. Then she shocked me even more because when I told her about the guy and what happened, she said that nobody lived in that house and that it had been abandoned ever since before she lived there, which was over 5 years at the time. I called the police, and they found nothing in the home or around it outside that would give the slightest clue as to what was going on. I think that he was most definitely squatting there for a place to live. Well, I still to this day haven't heard anything regarding the situation that happened to me, and I can't say for sure what would have happened had I been alone that night. I don't live in that house anymore, and I've been moved out for 3 years now. I had just graduated high school and I was 18 years old. I had been saving up money for almost a full year to finally get into my own apartment. My dad co-signed for me, and I was ready to be on my own. The rent was reasonably priced, and I was going to have my own space. The apartment was only a short walk away from the college where I was about to be a freshman at, so a lot of the tenants were students that went to the same school. I met a couple of friends that shared similar interests, and we would hang out from time to time. There was this one guy, though, who always seemed weird. None of us knew who he was, but we always seemed to see him, it felt like, no matter what we were doing. He would ride around on his bike every day, and we would always run into him one way or another. He would stare at us very menacingly, and we kind of wrote him off as a neighborhood creep. One night when I was fast asleep, I woke up in the middle of the night to sounds of yelling and screaming. The walls were paper thin, and that's why I could hear what was going on so well. It was very clear to me that it was coming from the apartment next to mine. My neighbor was a woman that was around my age, and all I could hear was her telling someone to leave over and over again. My first instinct was to knock on the door myself and see if I could be of any help to the girl. But the screaming died down shortly after, and I thought it was none of my business. So maybe it was best to stay out of it. I somehow managed to fall back asleep, and when I woke up in the morning around 8 o'clock, I had this sinking feeling in my chest that something was wrong. I made my way over to my neighbor's apartment and knocked on the door, and finally, after knocking 4 or 5 times and waiting forever, someone finally opened the door. They only cracked it open just a bit, just enough for them to peek their eye out and for me to see a small part of their head. It was dark in there, unusually dark, so I couldn't really make out who I was talking to. "Hey, everything all right in there?" I asked. The guy quickly grew defensive and asked me what I was talking about. I told him to cut the crap, and I straight up told him I heard what happened last night with all the yelling and screaming. He immediately shut the door and told me he had no idea what I was talking about. Very angrily, I made my way back to my apartment, trying to figure out what I should do. I figured there was nothing I could do. I thought it was most definitely too late to call the police, so in a flurry, I decided to go back to my neighbor's apartment with the idea in my head that I was going to demand answers. I just had such a horrible feeling, and I couldn't just not do something about it. I knocked on the door once again, and the same person answered the door. This time much faster, and they opened it all the way. I was puzzled when I saw that it was the same creepy guy my friends and I always see around the neighborhood. "Dude, where's the girl?" "Huh?" he said. "I don't know." I told him that I needed him to stop lying and that I needed answers. I then smelled this horrible foul smell that was leaking out of the apartment. I told them that I knew the girl who lived there and that I wanted to see her to make sure she was okay. He told me I was crazy, and he shut the door once again. I was so frustrated at this point that I began kicking the door. I don't know if I was attempting to break in or not. It was just all sort of a blur when it happened. I was just so angry. The only thing I could do was call the police and tell them everything I knew. So that's exactly what I did. Police showed up and demanded entry, and what they discovered was next level unimaginable. They found the girl whose name was Kaylee, and her body was all chopped up with her arms, legs, and even her head completely dismembered from her body. I'm lucky I didn't have to see that, but ever since that day, my guilty conscience has been eating at me. There's not a single day that goes by that I don't think about this and beat myself up for what happened. Knowing I could have potentially saved her life is what hurts the most. The amount of shame I've felt and carried with me for the past 5 years has consumed me and completely changed me as a person. The man who killed her is now sitting in prison, by the way, and received a death sentence for what he had done. This happened to me a few years ago. It's a kind of a long story. I'm a female and was 24 years old at the time. I had just moved into a new apartment with my roommate, who was a 21-year-old female, while we were finishing college. It had a pretty nice porch in the front yard, so when it was warm outside, I would often hang out in the front and read. The apartment was a duplex, so we had the full top floor unit, and my neighbor underneath me had the full bottom floor. Most of the buildings around us were set up the same. One day, I was sitting outside when a neighbor from the building directly to the left of us introduced himself to me. He was good-looking, probably in his early 30s, and seemed nice and normal enough. He mentioned that he was married and had a daughter, and that they also lived in the top floor unit. He said that it was nice to have other young people in the neighborhood, and that maybe we could have drinks together sometime. I said sure in a trying to be nice, knowing we will probably never make plans kind of way, and didn't think too much of it. After that, I seemed to run into him constantly. I would go outside, and not even 5 minutes later, he would be getting the mail or grabbing something from his car or coming out to sit on his porch. There was always some seemingly innocent excuse that we bumped into each other, and he always wanted to chat. He became pretty insistent that he wanted to hang out. Just us. Never any mention of his wife being there. This made me uncomfortable, and I was ready with a vague excuse to brush him off. After one run-in with him, I left the house later to find a post-it note with his name and number on it taped to my door, telling me to text him so we could make plans. I threw it away. I mentioned this to my roommate, and we both kind of shrugged it off and figured that even though he was weird, it still seemed relatively harmless. This is where it starts to get really creepy. It slowly became more and more obvious that bumping into each other all the time was not a coincidence. I had a night class one semester where I had to leave my apartment around 6:45 p.m. on Tuesday and Thursday nights. At this point, it was wintertime, so when I left, it was completely dark outside. Literally, as I would be turning around to lock my door, he happened to be stepping out of his apartment as well, always wanting to chat, trying to make plans, etc. This definitely bothered me, but I was still in denial that there was a chance he could be watching me, or knew when I would be leaving the house. One of these nights that I bumped into him, I came home from class and jumped in the shower. My roommate worked evenings, so I was home alone. The apartment buildings were so close together that I could see the creepy neighbor's kitchen pretty clearly from my bedroom window since we were both on the top floor. I usually had my blinds closed at night, but it had been sunny that day and the apartment across from me was completely dark. I just didn't think anything of it and was walking around in my towel, sitting on my bed, playing on my phone, etc. Out of nowhere, I see a flashing light in the window next to me. It took me a minute to register what was happening. Someone was taking photos of me from his kitchen window in complete darkness. I instantly closed my blinds, and not even a minute later, my doorbell rang. Again and again. At this point, I'm freaking out and realize it had to be him ringing my doorbell. I, of course, didn't answer and called my roommate, who told me she would be home soon. He probably rang my doorbell at least 10 times before giving up. Finally, my roommate came home and I told her what happened. We are sitting in my room on the edge of my bed talking. The blinds are pulled all the way down except for maybe 4 to 5 inches on one window. And since we were sitting, I guess you could still kind of see us, but just barely. As we are talking, we see flashing lights in his window again, still completely dark in the kitchen. My roommate is like, "What the fuck?" and pulls the blinds all the way down. The doorbell starts ringing again. We both decided hell no to answering the door, and he probably rings about 10 times before stopping. The next night I had night class. My doorbell rings around 6:40, right when I usually leave. My heart literally froze, thinking there was no way it could be the dude from next door. The doorbell rings probably 6 or 7 more times. I didn't go to class that night. I consider calling the cops, but I am personally terrified of cops, so that is really a last resort for me. Soon after this, my parents came in town to visit, and I hesitantly told them what had been going on. I didn't want them to freak out, but of course they freaked out. My dad installed a motion detector light right above my front door and a massive sliding lock. Although it was against my wishes, my mom told my downstairs neighbor, a nice middle-aged lady who I knew also knew him. After this, the doorbell stopped ringing and I was able to successfully avoid him for a couple of weeks. One day, I think I'm in a clear walking from my car to my front door when he comes rushing out of his apartment. He was so quick, I really couldn't avoid him even though I kept walking to my door. He said he was sorry for scaring me and that he was only ringing my doorbell and flashing lights in my window to try and get me to come outside. Not sure why this is a valid reason though. He said he was actually moving and wanted to know if I wanted some nice bartending tools before he gave them away. I was honestly terrified of him and kind of frozen, but managed to say some type of no and go inside my apartment. When I left the house later, there was a box of bar tools on my porch. Finally, he moved away and I didn't have to worry about leaving my house all the time. I ran into my downstairs neighbor who apologized for what happened. She said he had lived next to them for a few years and had no idea he would do something like that. She also told me that the reason they moved was because he cheated on his wife and she left him and took their daughter. I live in a downstairs flat in a small block surrounded by other small blocks. Some of my neighbors are very trashy and are always shouting and arguing. No exaggeration. The police must be called out at least once a week because one of the neighbors would cause a disturbance. Anyway, a few months ago, at about 10 at night, from the lounge, I could see my kitchen window, and something caught my eye. I got up and went to the window, and there was a man standing there with his hands up looking through. As I approached the window, he started to knock on it. He looked really rough, maybe like a junkie. I told him to go away, but he continued to just stand there staring. At this point, I was starting to feel a little uneasy, so I told him I was going to call the police. He kept smiling at me in a really creepy way. Then he just turned around and walked off without saying a word, like nothing ever happened. I think he lives somewhere near me, as I've seen him again. We have never spoken about his strange behavior that night. He still really gives me the creeps. I know he was probably just high on drugs. This happened a couple of summers ago. Typically, I place a large box fan in my window at night, both for the soothing noise and to maintain a cool temperature in my room. While I've always harbored a mild discomfort about the possibility of my neighbors catching a glimpse of me through my window, I never anticipated anything beyond an inadvertent glance while I slept. However, my perception of normalcy was shattered last night when I found myself in a disconcerting situation involving my peculiar neighbor. Upon seeing my neighbor through his illuminated window, he was gazing into my room with no shame at all. Initially, I dismissed it, attributing the unsettling image to a figment of my imagination, or perhaps an optical illusion. To my dismay, upon a second check, it became evident that my initial assumption was wrong. He was still there, unrelenting and not a mere bystander. His unbroken stare, coupled with a disconcerting smile, sent shivers down my spine. The oddities exhibited by our neighbors have always been a cause for concern. They would engage in peculiar activities such as watering the lawn during rainfall and displaying excessive smoking and drinking habits. They've consistently been an unsettling presence. This latest encounter, however, has taken their peculiar behavior to an entirely new level, leaving me deeply unnerved. Being only 14 years old, this unnerving experience has left me grappling with a sense of vulnerability. I find myself asking, what can or should I do to put an end to these unsettling encounters with my neighbors? While their oddity was always present, this recent incident has pushed me to seek advice on how to navigate this uncomfortable situation. So I must say, I acknowledge that I might be overthinking this scenario, but the discomfort it has caused is undeniable. While this experience may sound like a creepy story, I assure you it's not an embellishment. This encounter genuinely disturbed me despite having faced scarier situations in the past. Me and my girlfriend rented an apartment for a month. The area was secluded, and after dark, everybody would mind their own business. Neighbors would hardly talk to each other or even be outside in the evening. Our apartment was in a building with 4 floors, and each floor had a single apartment. All the apartments were very compact and built to be rented to students. The night we moved in, our taps ran out of water, so I went upstairs, hoping to borrow some from the people living upstairs. I realized that 2 out of the 4 apartments were vacant and locked. The apartment on the 4th floor was lit from the inside, so I decided to ring the bell. But to my disappointment, nobody answered. Over the next week, we used to hear the sound of someone whacking a rod, or some sort of metal on maybe the floor, or some other object. This would start late at night after 1:30 a.m. and continue for hours. Initially, we didn't care about it, but after some time, it got us intrigued. The sound was clearly from one of the apartments above us, but as I already mentioned, 2 of the 3 were vacant for sure, and the 3rd one seemed vacant, but was lit from the inside. I knocked on its door many times, but no one answered. The whacking sound was a daily occurrence, and on some very late nights, we could hear someone climbing the stairs. It seemed as if we were the only ones living in this building, especially during the day and until the very late nights. We made up theories to convince ourselves that it was nothing, but the pattern of the whacking was too irregular for it to be made by wind or something other than a person. It would start almost daily at around the same time. We asked people around, but didn't get any satisfactory answer. No one knew if anyone lived there. Towards the end of our stay, I saw a shady-looking man going upstairs during the day. I asked him if he was the owner of the apartments upstairs. He said he was, also including the one on the 4th floor. I asked him if anyone lived upstairs and also about the whacking sound. He told me no one did and that he's looking for tenants. He said that he had no idea about the sound. To my surprise, he then asked me, "So, for how long are you staying here?" 4 more days. We'll leave on the 30th of this month, I replied. He asked me if anyone else had rented the place for the next month, and I told him that I didn't know. So, the strangest part is that for the next 4 days, there was neither the whacking sound nor the sound of someone climbing up the stairs late at night. However, my girlfriend's internship got extended by 2 days, and we decided to stay there. And just as I had anticipated, the whacking sound resumed after the 30th, the day we were supposed to leave. I don't know what it was. I won't ever know, but I'm just happy that we got the heck out of that place without any consequences. It really scared me sometimes and feels weird thinking about it, even now. For 2 years, I lived in the capital city of a western estate. 2 days ago, I moved to a smaller town about 50 miles away to be closer to family and get out of the city. It's not Skid Row or San Fran yet, but there is a massive homeless problem in my old neighborhood. Lots of petty crime, meth labs, and tent camps. I would frequently walk past people passed out on the sidewalk, so when a neighbor in my small 8-unit building wanted to hang out one night, I jumped at the chance to go out and safely walk around with someone. So my neighbor Steve, I always thought that he was kind of cute, so when he knocked on my door one night, I decided, what the hell? I'm moving in less than 2 weeks and we hooked up. I also figured some of his weirdness had gone away since I'd known him for about a year or so. Steve was always kind of socially awkward. I could feel his eyes checking me out on the day I moved in last year. He commented on my skateboards, and another neighbor, Trent, was outside with Steve, drinking a beer and having cigarettes. They seemed to be friends. After a few days, I began to have a beer or two in a bowl with Steve on his second-floor landing that overlooked our alley parking. One day, after mooching too many cigarettes off of me, he told me my feet were cute. They certainly are not, and I'd known the guy for less than a week. I also had no intention of becoming involved with him because he was my neighbor. It really weirded me out. I actively avoided him for the rest of the year until a few weeks ago. I would just wave hello and stuff like that. So back to when he initially knocked on my door. We spent a few days hanging out, and he started to get stupidly clingy. Like, if we hung out on Monday night, he wouldn't leave until Tuesday afternoon for work, and then want to see me again after he got done. Fine, whatever. I was getting laid and leaving soon, so why not? One night, I ran out of smokes and wanted to pass by the corner store Trent worked at for more. He was always really pleasant to me, so when I saw him working, I bounded in without a thought and said,
"Let's say hi, Trent is working."
The atmosphere changed 100%, because right after saying that, Trent starts calling Steve a piece of shit, asking him why he dared him to come in the store.
Fuck you.
He said. Steve was silent. Trent turns to me, wishes me a good night, and a warning.
Watch out for this one, Anna. He's a psycho.
I thought it was just bad blood or something. Friends have falling outs all the time. On the way to the bar, Steve literally ignored everything I asked about Trent. I'm not gonna lie, I was a bit concerned after that. So I told him I could just hang out by myself if he didn't want to say or do anything. I didn't feel like sitting in silence with a weirdo. Honestly, I remember leaving the bar and him trying to grab or hold my hand, but that's it. I drink too much anyway sometimes. So the amount I had was smaller than my regular. I didn't trust this guy anymore. The next thing I remember is muttering to someone in bright lights. I'm not on medications, and then next it was in a dark hospital room with machines beeping. My face felt like it was on fire, so I searched around for my bag and pulled out my phone to see what the fuck was up. 2 black eyes and a huge swelling on one side of my face. I texted Steve to leave me alone after I saw he sent me a few messages. He apologized that he panicked and was sorry. Whatever, asshole, I thought as I fell asleep. I was discharged from the hospital later that morning. I got a lecture from a doctor about alcohol. Discharge papers saying I fell and got shoved out the door as the dirty, uninsured person I am. Over the next day or so, I got a lot of support. I told my family and local friends who didn't let me sit at home alone. I got help from friends and was literally throwing everything randomly in boxes and booking a moving truck. I moved later that week with the help of a friend since I still had an eye swollen shut. Another guy friend whose family owned a dojo and does mixed martial arts told me I got hit in the face by a person. Who did this to you, Anna? What's their name? He asked. I believe this too, and come to think about it, I had no scrapes or bruises anywhere else. I have back issues and would have felt pain in my spine if I fell. On moving day, about 4 days after I was discharged, apparently, Steve sat on his ledge watching the movers pack my stuff in the truck and watched someone load my car up. I didn't watch and purposefully didn't look at him. Who is that guy watching us? A mover asked my friend. She just told them that we had to get the fuck out, so I think that gave them some general ideas. Over the next few days of me moving stuff in my car and on my move truck day, he kept asking me how I was, and that he was sorry and just panicked a few more times. So before blocking his number, I told him I knew he did this to me or was at least partially responsible somehow. I've gotten injured many times in college from drinking too much, skating, biking, etc., and never had this injury before. He told me that he was getting pizza, and I just fell. I can't believe he thinks I'm that stupid. Did he really expect me to believe that? Okay, whatever, I told him. Then I went to urgent care since my hematoma was not improving and hurt like hell. I asked the doctor if I actually fell. She said no, it was highly unlikely, especially after I showed her pictures of the injuries from before they relatively healed. So who is to say? But I'll rather trust the experts than some weirdo who apparently wanted to sleep with me all year. I can imagine. I probably told him to fuck off or something, and he might have gotten mad. I can't really say, though, since I don't remember. Nobody would let me go over there alone over the weekend. I left Trent a note under his door, warning him about Steve, and sped the fuck out of that city. Nobody knows my address. Steve doesn't have a car, and I expect to never set foot in that neighborhood again. For now, I'm just healing and looking forward to new changes. And to answer the question of getting an RPE kit done at the hospital, I don't think they did. If they did, I'm sure they would have said something. As previously mentioned, the only physical wounds were on my eyes and face. No scrapes or bruises anywhere else. Also, if you're wondering, I used to live in Denver. Stay safe out there and always trust your intuition. When I was younger, my family and I lived on a ranch. We spent most of our time there. My brother and I were taught at home by our aunt, who lived in a small building on the edge of the ranch, while we lived in the main house. Sometimes she would come over in the morning to teach us basic math and English. My brother and I had a simple dream. We wanted to work on the ranch as stable hands. We didn't want regular jobs, so we didn't worry about getting qualifications or going to university. Our life was peaceful, with no close neighbors. The nearest ones were about 3 miles away. However, we knew them well. They were an elderly couple that we would visit a few times a year. Sadly, they're not here anymore. This particular event happened when I was 19 years old. I am 26 now. I think my brother was out with his friends, and my mom and dad had gone out for the evening. My aunt was in her little house, and when she wasn't in the main house, we didn't disturb her. It was a rule we learned from a young age. If you needed aunt, you just gave her a call. I'd only been home alone for about 30 minutes. As I mentioned earlier, my mom and dad had gone out for dinner, which wasn't something they did very often. I wanted to go knock on my aunt's door, but I thought it might be impolite. I guess we were taught to be that way from a young age. It sounds silly now, but back then I was afraid to knock on my own aunt's door. So I decided to call her to ask if I could come over because I felt scared. I was 19 years old, which isn't really young, but I was a shy and anxious girl. Being alone in this huge 7-bedroom house made me feel scared. Every little noise, like creaking floors and dripping water, made me very uneasy. I couldn't find any peace or relaxation, no matter how loud I turned up the TV in the front room. So I called her number, and she answered almost right away. She knew it was me.
Emma, what's the matter?
You see, I didn't usually call her except for emergencies, especially after she finished homeschooling us. Once, when I was 9, my brother got really sick and started vomiting because of food poisoning. That was when Mom and Dad called Aunt to come and help. She helped us clean up all the vomit. I know it might sound tough like she's a caregiver, but my parents have very demanding jobs. That's how they can afford this ranch and the house. Now, back to the phone call. My aunt picked up and asked, "Emma, what's the matter?" "Nothing's wrong," I said. "Can I come over and see you?" I told her that I was feeling scared and alone. It was completely dark outside by then, and even though I had turned on almost every light in the house because of my fear, I was still frightened. We lived far from any street lights. Our place was surrounded by more than 100 acres of fields and land where animals grazed. When you looked out of the window, all you could see was darkness, except for the kitchen window, where you could see a faint light from my aunt's house. But usually those lights were so dim that you could hardly see them anyway. My aunt agreed and said,
Yes, of course. You can come over for a little while.
But she was getting ready to go to bed early because she used to wake up early to take care of the horses. I went to the kitchen door, took the key out of the lock, opened the door, and suddenly I felt like my body and mind were swallowed by darkness. My imagination went wild, thinking about all the scary and terrible things, like ghosts, demons, and killers. My brain was a mess, but I partly blame it on my love for reading horror and true crime. It's not a good idea to tempt fate with things that excite you, but deep down, you never actually want to experience them. So I decided to leave every light on in the house, even though my parents would be very angry if they came back before I left my aunt's. The distance from my house's door to my aunt's was very short. Maybe just 30 or 40 seconds if you ran, but around 1 to 2 minutes if you walked. It was like a small part of an athletic track, so you can imagine. I stood at my house's doorway, looking at the lights in my aunt's house. Her window had the warm glow of her living room light. I didn't know if I should run or walk slowly. I was so scared that I started shaking. I turned around and closed the door firmly behind me, put the key in the keyhole and turned it, making sure it was properly locked. Then I turned around and sprinted the whole way to her front door. So I didn't even bother to knock, as I was really scared and almost sure someone was chasing me, but no one was chasing me. I was just being overly anxious and a little scaredy cat. I remember my aunt mentioning that I came in without even knocking or telling her. I knew she might be annoyed, but she wasn't as strict as my mom and dad, so I knew she wouldn't scold me or hit me. In this case, I walked in, took off my shoes, and joined her in the front living room. The place where my aunt lived used to be an old barn. It was converted into a cozy living space with my parents' help. She had her own kitchen, bathroom, a separate living room, and everything she needed, including a spacious bedroom. She didn't want a big place, even though we offered her a spot in the main house. She valued her independence, and some of her friends still visited her, although we didn't really get along with them. So it was best for her to have her own space. My aunt enjoyed watching old TV shows from the 80s, and some were even black and white from the 60s and 70s. I thought most of them were quite dull, except for the James Bond movies from the 80s and 90s. They were pretty cool and interesting to watch. Unfortunately, she didn't play them often, but when she did, she'd invite me over because I liked those movies. I stayed at her place for a few hours until she kindly said it was time for her to go to bed. I was worried about the next few hours because my parents weren't coming home until 1 in the morning. It was only 10:30 and I practically begged her to let me stay. I tried to act like I was interested in the show she was watching, asking if I could stay and finish watching it, but she knew I was lying. She walked me to the back door, had me put on my shoes, and then let me out. As soon as she closed the door behind her, I ran in a state of panic. I reached the front door and unlocked it quickly. Later, I eventually fell asleep, even with all the lights on, but suddenly, the home phone rang loudly, right against my ear. It hurt, and the ringing was so loud that it startled me. Our home phone didn't have a caller ID to show who was calling, unlike a mobile phone. It was one of the oldest styles of home phones, but it was still cordless, so you could take it from the base station and walk around the house.
Emma, you need to go to your bedroom and lock the door. Don't turn on any of the lights, and don't leave the house. Do you understand?
My aunt had never called like this, and I had no idea what to think. Not sure of what to ask her, I replied. "What's the matter?"
Emma, just listen to me and do what I say, please.
Previously, she had told me she was going to bed, and that was more than an hour and a half ago. So I was genuinely puzzled about why she had just called me, but I was also curious at the same time. So I opened my window, stuck my head out, and looked to the left. From there, I could see the south end of the house where the outbuilding was where my aunt lived. Just as I was about to close the window, I heard some noises. I quickly opened the window again and looked to my left, thinking it was my aunt, but it wasn't. It was a man dressed all in black, and I didn't recognize him. I gasped as he almost looked up at me. I could see he had now turned and was facing the side of the house where my window was. I quickly ducked and closed the curtains as quietly and slowly as I could. Then, I hurried to my bedroom door, opened it, and ran to my parents' room at the other end of the hallway. I opened their door and went to their front window. From there, I could see the front driveway, and I noticed 3 cars with their lights still on. The lights were shining on the property. 2 men were standing with the car doors open, and 1 was walking around the house. A few moments later, I heard the phone ringing again. I picked up the phone and answered right away, expecting to hear my aunt's voice, but there was silence after a few seconds. I was still listening, and then a man's voice said, "Your aunt is safe with us." I felt a chill run down my whole body. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I hung up and started screaming in my own bedroom. As I was screaming, I began to hear gunshots coming from the front driveway. My dad had arrived and started shooting at the guys. My aunt was found tied to a chair in her living room, and the men had done terrible things to her. She had called me when she saw them driving up the driveway. My dad had to defend our family, and he ended up killing one of the guys. He wasn't charged because it was considered self-defense. We had evidence that the other guys were armed because my dad always had a dash cam in the car. In the end, our family survived the night, and my dad's actions were deemed self-defense, but my aunt changed after that. She became more like a robot,